Cecil B. DeMille's masterpiece, The Ten Commandments.
There's a reason people still confuse this movie's version of ancient Egypt with the real thing. Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments hit theaters in November of 1956, and it wasn't just a Bible story. It was one of the biggest, most obsessively researched productions Hollywood had ever attempted. DeMille was 73 years old when he made it. He climbed a mountain during filming, suffered a heart attack, and got right back to work. Charlton Heston played Moses, a man born into royalty who discovers he was actually born into slavery, walks away from a throne, and follows a voice out of a burning bush. Yul Brynner played Pharaoh, a man so stubborn that 10 plagues, a drowned army, and a dead son still couldn't make him admit he was wrong. The finished film ran almost 4 hours, and somehow it never dragged. Today we're digging into 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally unbelievable facts about how this movie actually got made. A film that nearly cast a cowboy as Moses, quietly cut an entire plague because it was too funny, brought a dying actor to set in an ambulance, and turned a publicity stunt into a Supreme Court case. And stay through to the end, because the very last fact might be sitting on a courthouse lawn somewhere close to where you live right now. Let's get into it. Before Charlton Heston ever set foot on the set, DeMille wanted a completely different kind of leading man. William Boyd, the actor behind Hopalong Cassidy. It sounds strange today, but in the early 1950s, turning down that kind of stardom for a biblical epic wasn't an easy call, and Boyd's team advised him against it. Their reasoning was blunt. Playing Moses simply didn't fit the image Boyd had spent years building, and that image was enormous. Hopalong Cassidy wasn't just a character. It was practically an industry. Over 100 companies had licensing deals tied to the name, slapping Boyd's cowboy persona onto everything from lunchboxes and roller skates to soap, watches, and even motor oil. By 1950, Boyd was pulling in something like $800,000 a year, the bulk of it from merchandising alone. He was receiving roughly 15,000 fan letters every single week and had landed on the cover of a national magazine. His lunchbox is often cited as the first character-licensed lunchbox in American history, a small but genuinely significant footnote in pop culture. So when DeMille came calling, Boyd's camp said the switch would confuse or alienate the audience he'd spent a decade cultivating. DeMille moved on. He reportedly considered Kirk Douglas, Dan Daly, and briefly Rock Hudson before Charlton Heston entered the picture. Not through some dramatic screen test, but because DeMille reportedly noticed that a photograph of Heston bore a striking resemblance to Michelangelo's sculpture of Moses. That resemblance, more than anything else, sealed the casting. Boyd retired the Hopalong Cassidy character in 1953 and passed away in 1972. Heston, meanwhile, became so associated with the role of Moses that for generations, his face is essentially what people picture when they think of the Exodus story. A face that still shows up on television every Easter season, decades after the film's release. Somewhere in an alternate version of film history, a singing cowboy carried the staff up the mountain instead. Fresh off her star-making performance in Roman Holiday, Audrey Hepburn was arguably the hottest actress in Hollywood by the mid-1950s. She was already under contract with Paramount, the very studio producing The Ten Commandments. On paper, casting her should have been a formality. The role in question was Nefertiti, the Egyptian throne princess so magnetic that Moses is willing to walk away from a kingdom just to escape her, and so central to the plot that Pharaoh essentially starts a war rather than accept her rejection of him. It was considered one of the most coveted female roles being cast that year. But DeMille passed on Hepburn, not over her acting, but over her build. In his judgment, her frame didn't carry the kind of physical presence he wanted for the elaborate Egyptian costuming. He reportedly felt she lacked the classical curves he associated with Egyptian royalty on screen. So the search continued. Nearly a dozen actresses were considered for the role, including major names like Vivien Leigh and Jane Russell, before the part eventually went to and Baxter, who, notably, had originally been eyed for the far smaller role of Moses' wife. It's a strange footnote considering how the story ends. In 1990, decades after being passed over, Audrey Hepburn accepted the Cecil B. DeMille Award, Hollywood's Lifetime Achievement honor named for the very director who once decided she wasn't physically right for his movie. History has a way of circling back, with a bit of irony intact. The biblical account gives Egypt 10 plagues, but DeMille only put a handful of them fully on screen, and one that he actually filmed in full never made it into the final cut: the Plague of Frogs. According to accounts from the production, DeMille shot an entire sequence of frogs overwhelming the Egyptian palace, with panicked extras scrambling to escape the chaos. When he screened the footage, he reportedly hated the result. Instead of feeling like a moment of divine judgment, it played almost like slapstick comedy. Frogs hopping everywhere is inherently a little silly, no matter how seriously you shoot it. So, an entire biblical plague, filmed on what was then one of the most expensive productions in Hollywood history, ended up on the cutting room floor because it undercut the tone DeMille was going for. Meanwhile, the plague that did make it into the film, the fiery hail battering Pharaoh's palace, achieved its effect through a method that's almost comically low-tech by comparison. That hail wasn't made of anything remotely realistic. It was popcorn, spray-painted white, and dumped over the set from above. It was light enough that it wouldn't actually hurt anyone on set, and bouncy enough on camera to read convincingly as falling debris. Crews reportedly swept it up and reused it between takes to save time and money. The flames layered over the hail sequence were added afterward, hand-animated frame by frame. So one of the film's most dramatic plagues was, quite literally, built out of movie theater snack food. Charlton Heston stood somewhere around 6'3". Yul Brynner was closer to 5'8". For the film to work, the two of them needed to feel like equals fighting over the same throne. Two towering, immovable forces colliding. Height wasn't something Brynner could change, so instead, he changed everything else. Knowing he'd be shirtless for much of the film and standing directly beside Heston in scene after scene, Brynner reportedly refused to be visually overshadowed. He committed to an intense weightlifting regimen and transformed his physique, turning Pharaoh into one of the most physically imposing figures in the film despite the height difference. That effort ended up paying off in an unexpected second way. Around that same period, Brynner was also reprising his famous stage role in The King and I for its film adaptation. The muscular, powerful build he brought to that role, often remembered as looking a little more physically dominant than a typical royal court might expect, was essentially leftover conditioning from his refusal to be dwarfed by Heston on the set of The Ten Commandments. Both films landed in theaters within the same year, 1956. Brynner bulked up to hold his own against Moses, and it was the other role that ultimately won him the Academy Award for Best Actor. A strange but very real trade-off. Extra muscle built for one movie, an Oscar earned in another. Many classic film fans recognize actor H.B. Warner as Mr. Gower, the grieving druggist in It's a Wonderful Life. But to Cecil B. DeMille, Warner represented something far more personal. Decades earlier, in 1927, DeMille had cast Warner in the title role of Jesus Christ for his silent film The King of Kings, a performance that defined Warner's career and made him one of the most recognizable faces in religious cinema at the time. Now, nearly 30 years later, making what he suspected might be his final film, DeMille wanted the same man who had once portrayed Christ to appear somewhere within his retelling of the Exodus. By this point, Warner was elderly and living in a nursing facility. According to accounts of the production, DeMille arranged for an ambulance to bring him directly to the Paramount lot. Warner was reportedly carried onto the soundstage on a stretcher and kept on oxygen between camera setups. He filmed a scene playing a frail, elderly slave being physically carried by other men in the scene, and was carried back out the same day he arrived. He was reportedly too weak to remember his scripted dialogue, so DeMille allowed him to improvise loosely around the moment. It turned out to be the final speaking role of his career. Across his lifetime on screen, H.B. Warner had now portrayed a central figure from both the Old and New Testaments. Take a close look at Moses' robe in the second half of the film, a combination of rust, white, and black. It turns out those colors are technically historically accurate for the period, but according to the story behind the costume, nobody involved planned it that way. The costume was designed by artist Arnold Freberg, and he reportedly chose that particular color combination for a purely practical reason. It created strong visual contrast against the pale tones of the Egyptian costumes and read vividly on Technicolor film stock, especially from the back rows of a movie theater. It wasn't until later, according to accounts from the production's research team, that someone realized rust, white, and black happened to correspond to the traditional colors historically associated with the tribe of Levi, which, in the biblical account, is Moses' own tribe. A costuming decision made entirely for visual pop on camera turned out to be accidentally accurate to ancient tradition. That kind of coincidence only really lands because of how seriously DeMille approached historical accuracy everywhere else. His research team reportedly combed through the writings of the ancient historian Josephus, along with rabbinic texts and other historical sources. The stone tablets used in the film were carved from granite actually sourced from Mount Sinai. DeMille brought in a university scholar specifically to inscribe them in an authentic ancient script. He even climbed Sinai himself during preparation for the film. Freeberg himself wasn't a professional costume designer by trade. He was more of a devoted Bible history enthusiast whom DeMille recruited specifically because of that passion. So amid all that scholarly effort and literal mountain climbing, one of the movie's most accurate details ended up being the one nobody was actually trying to get right. The infant drifting down the Nile in a reed basket in the film isn't a hired child actor. That's Charlton Heston's actual son, and DeMille reportedly built part of the shooting schedule around him. According to the story, while Heston's wife was pregnant, he mentioned it in passing to DeMille, and producer Henry Wilcoxon reportedly connected the dots almost immediately. If the baby turned out to be a boy, why not simply cast him as the infant Moses? Fraser Clark Heston was born in February of 1955, and DeMille reportedly timed the filming of the basket sequence, shot in a water tank built on Paramount's recreated Nile set, to align with Fraser reaching exactly 3 months old, matching the age given for Moses in the biblical account when his mother sets him adrift. Fraser reportedly even received a special industry recognition for the role, making him one of the youngest people ever formally honored for a film performance. He went on to grow up and become a director himself, eventually directing his own father in later television projects. It's a strange bit of symmetry. The infant floating helplessly in a basket on screen eventually grew up to be the one calling the shots behind the camera. At 73 years old, in the middle of production, Cecil B. DeMille had a heart attack, and, according to the accounts that have circulated since, he simply went back to work almost immediately. The incident reportedly happened after a camera needed checking near the top of the massive gate structure built for the Exodus sequence, standing roughly 107 feet tall, about the height of a 10-story building. Rather than sending a crew member up to inspect it, DeMille reportedly climbed it himself. At the top, in the heat of the Egyptian location shoot, his heart gave out. Doctors ordered weeks of bed rest. DeMille was reportedly back on set within a couple of days. The production itself had already taken a serious physical toll on him. The desert shoot reportedly stripped more than 20 pounds off his frame between the heat, the dust storms, and a punishing schedule that required each day's footage to be trucked for hours to Cairo, packed in dry ice, flown back to Hollywood for DeMille's review, and then flown back again, multiple times a week. At 73, visibly thinner, and running on a heart doctors estimated had limited time left, DeMille reportedly made an arrangement with his own physician that allowed him to continue directing while the crew quietly took on more of the physical demands of the shoot. According to reports, the studio was told the whole episode was simply a case of dysentery, so as not to shake confidence in the production. DeMille had apparently been warned this could realistically be his final film. He finished it anyway. The Ten Commandments premiered in November of 1956. DeMille passed away in January of 1959, at 77, from heart failure. Some directors step away once a production wraps. DeMille, by most accounts, kept going because there simply wasn't another picture left in him to make. DeMille had secured an agreement to film extensively in Egypt, a deal that had been approved through official channels, sandstorms, logistics, and all. But by the time cameras were actually ready to roll, the government he'd originally negotiated with had been replaced, forcing his team to renegotiate the entire arrangement essentially from scratch in 1954. Remarkably, it went well. The new leadership reportedly held DeMille's earlier film The Crusades in high regard, and were particularly fond of its star, Henry Wilcoxon, who, as it happened, was standing right there as the production's associate producer. According to accounts of the negotiations, some of the officials involved had admired Wilcoxon so much years earlier that one of them had even taken on a nickname inspired by him. Whatever the reason, the new deal ended up being even bigger than the original. Roughly 200 cavalry officers were provided to portray Pharaoh's chariot army, and the Egyptian Air Force reportedly flew planes low over the desert specifically to whip up realistic sandstorms for the cameras. Real military assets, borrowed to make a biblical epic look more authentic. Then the timing turned unfortunate. Just days before the film's November 1956 premiere, regional conflict erupted, and Egypt ended up banning the Ten Commandments outright. Reports